Luigi Mangione.
Luigi Mangione.
Luigi Mangione.
Why did Luigi Mangione's case rise to the level of... When we're talking about school shooters, we don't often see that additional charge.
How could a young man with everything wealth, privilege, and a bright future become one of the most notorious criminals of his time? Born into a life of luxury, with access to a prestigious education and a family legacy that placed him among the wealthiest, Luigi had every opportunity to succeed.
The Mangione family is one of the prominent families of Baltimore County. They own a lot of real estate, they own golf courses, they're just a very well-respected name.
Instead of using his advantages for good, he chose a path that led to his downfall, now facing a future of legal battles and a potential life sentence. People are left wondering how did someone with so much to lose choose a path that would shatter lives and send shockwaves through an entire industry? The events that led to Luigi's crime weren't the result of a sudden decision, but the result of months of planning. His frustration with the health insurance industry, particularly with United Healthcare and its CEO Brian Thompson, grew over time.
Thompson's predecessor, Andrew Whitty, praised Thompson when announcing he'd been named CEO of the company. CEO of United Health Group, Brian Thompson was responsible for leading growth across the company. Thompson was paid $10.2 million per year.
Luigi believed that the industry was corrupt and greedy, and over time his anger transformed into resentment, which began to consume him. His anger wasn't broad or unfocused. It was directed squarely at Brian Thompson, whom he held responsible for the system he despised. The crime that followed wasn't impulsive. It was a deliberate act, carefully planned and executed.
A manhunt is underway right now for the gunman who shot the top executive of America's largest private health insurance company.
The New York Police Department says he was targeted in a pre-planned attack.
Luigi spent weeks preparing his every move, meticulously thought out. He wasn't desperate or confused. He was focused on his goal, carrying out a mission he had crafted with precision. On the day of the crime, the streets of Midtown Manhattan were just like any other busy morning. People hurried to work, tourists roamed the streets, and vendors began setting up for the day's business. Luigi, however, moved through the crowd unnoticed. Surveillance footage from that morning later showed him walking calmly through the busy streets, blending seamlessly into the flow of foot traffic. He didn't stand out, he wasn't acting strangely to anyone watching. He was just another person going about his day. His demeanor was calm and controlled. There was no sign of nervousness, no hasty movements, no indication that something extraordinary was about to happen. He was the picture of composure, almost robotic in his focus. The ordinary appearance of his actions added to the chilling nature of what he was about to do. No one would have guessed that a calculated crime was underway.
Luigi Mangione. The cops couldn't arrest him from the crime scene. All they had was a CCTV photo, so naturally they released the picture online. The hope was that someone would see him and tip them off.
At one point during his walk, Luigi stopped into a nearby coffee shop. The cafe was full of morning customers, grabbing their drinks or enjoying a quiet breakfast. Luigi entered, ordered his coffee, and found a seat to those around him. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He sat quietly, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. It was a short, seemingly insignificant break, but in reality, it was part of the larger plan he was carrying out. The calmness of this moment highlighted the cold, calculated nature of his intentions during this time. No one could have known what was running through Luigi's mind. Was he reviewing the final details of his plan? Was he waiting for the right moment to act? Perhaps he was simply buying his time, reflecting on the enormity of what he was about to do. If he felt any doubt or hesitation, it wasn't visible. Those around him saw only a man who appeared to be enjoying a quiet moment in the city. This break in the coffee shop was not just a pause, it was part of the strategy.
Targeted of Brian Thompson, CEO of United Healthcare, last Wednesday in Midtown Manhattan. The suspect was in a McDonald's and was recognized by an employee.
Luigi was doing everything he could to avoid detection and remain inconspicuous. Every action, every decision was calculated to ensure that he remained undetected until the moment he was ready to act. It was a brief interlude in what would turn out to be a day of chaos, a moment of stillness before everything changed. When Luigi left the coffee shop and returned to the crowded streets of Manhattan, he was prepared, his mind was focused, his body calm. He was ready to continue the next phase of his plan. His actions were deliberate and controlled, a sign that he had been thinking ahead and carefully planning every step of his move to the outside world. Luigi was just another person going about their day. But for him, the day had taken a dark and deliberate turn. Later that morning, Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare, was leaving an investor conference. Like most days, he walked along West 54th Street, probably unaware of the man who was watching him from the crowd. Luigi, having waited for this moment, was now ready to act. While the street was filled with people, Luigi's focus was entirely on Brian. Everyone else on the street, pedestrians and passers-by, were ignored. For Luigi, there was only one target: Brian Thompson. Luigi Mangione's crime was an act of meticulous planning and cold execution. It wasn't a moment of rage or impulse, but a carefully calculated strike against the very system he despised. The day began like any other, with the usual bustle of Midtown Manhattan, a crowd of busy pedestrians, tourists, and street vendors filling the sidewalks. But beneath this ordinary scene, Luigi had already set his plan into motion. As he walked through the city, he blended into the crowd with eerie calmness. Not a single hint of the violence he was about to unleash. After stopping for a brief coffee break at a nearby cafe, Luigi continued his journey, unfazed by the chaos around him. He had time to reflect, to focus, to be sure of his plan. This calm exterior masked the true nature of his intentions. His mission was to target Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare, whom he blamed for what he perceived as the corruption of the health insurance industry. Luigi wasn't driven by fleeting anger or momentary frustration. His resentment had been building for months, turning into a focused, destructive obsession. At 10:15 a.m., as Brian Thompson exited a nearby investor conference and began walking along West 54th Street, Luigi saw his chance. Without hesitation, he pulled out a gun and shot Thompson. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the street, breaking the early morning noise of the city. Thompson collapsed, his body hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. The crowd around him froze. Some screamed in shock, and others dove for cover, unable to process the sudden violence in their midst. As the scene erupted in panic, Luigi quickly executed the next phase of his plan, his escape. He had taken great care to ensure that his getaway would be swift and seamless. Just a few blocks away, Luigi had left an epic ready for use. The epic had been disassembled with the battery carefully removed and carried with him to prevent anyone from stealing it. He reattached the battery and mounted the bike, riding away through the bustling city streets. With the same calm determination that had defined his earlier movements, his route was calculated, avoiding major intersections and crowded areas to ensure he wouldn't be seen. By the time law enforcement responded to the scene, which biased W think before wasn't, Luigi had disappeared into the city, leaving no immediate trace of his whereabouts. Investigation began almost immediately. Authorities scoured surveillance footage, hoping to identify the perpetrator. Witnesses reported seeing a man who had moved deliberately through the streets. He hadn't seemed out of place, yet his calm demeanor set him apart from the frantic crowd. In the aftermath of the shooting in the days that followed, the authorities reviewed video footage of the scene, and all signs pointed to Luigi Mangione as the culprit. The images showed him walking through the crowd before the shooting, and then calmly leaving the scene afterward, a picture of composure amidst the chaos as investigators pieced together the events. They also uncovered physical evidence that directly linked Luigi to the crime. Forensic teams collected ballistic evidence and fingerprints from the crime scene. These pieces of evidence built a solid case against Luigi. But the most damning discovery came when authorities searched his personal belongings. Hidden among his possessions was a notebook filled with meticulously detailed entries that revealed his motivations and state of mind leading up to the crime. The notebook painted a chilling portrait of a man obsessed with the health insurance system, particularly with Brian Thompson. His writings expressed anger and frustration at the perceived corruption within the industry. Luigi's disdain for the health insurance system was not just vague resentment. It was a focused animosity, particularly toward the individuals he viewed as its architects. His entries read like a manifesto, outlining his beliefs that the industry was exploiting the poor and perpetuating injustice. In one chilling passage, he wrote, "The target is insurance. It checks every box." These words underscored his intent to take direct action, and the notebook confirmed that this wasn't a crime of impulse. It was an act of revenge against an entire system he deemed corrupt. Days after the shooting, Luigi was apprehended in Altoona, Pennsylvania. The nationwide manhunt that followed his escape had narrowed down his location, and he was caught after fleeing the scene. Authorities had hoped that his capture would bring clarity to the case, but it only revealed more about the depth of his planning and resolve. Among his belongings was a 3D printed firearm, an unsettling piece of evidence that demonstrated not only his technical skills, but also his willingness to go to extreme lengths to carry out his plan. The weapon, which was undetectable by traditional means, hinted at the premeditated nature of his crime. Alongside the weapon, investigators found ammunition that bore cryptic inscriptions, further suggesting that his crime was intended to convey a message. Also found in his possession was a letter he had written to federal authorities in which he acknowledged his crime and took full responsibility. In the letter, Luigi made it clear that he had acted alone with no external support or collaborators. He revealed that the entire operation had been self-funded, with every aspect of the crime carefully planned and executed on his own. This letter not only provided a confession, but also gave further insight into his mindset. By addressing the authorities directly, Luigi seemed to want to control the narrative surrounding his crime, framing it as a deliberate and justified action. In the weeks following his capture, authorities delved deeper into his personal history, examining his communications and interactions leading up to the crime. They discovered a man who had been consumed by his beliefs, someone whose frustration with the system had boiled over into violence. But what was perhaps most disturbing was the growing realization that Luigi had viewed his actions not as a tragic mistake, but as a calculated statement. The revelations in the wake of his arrest sent shock waves through the public and legal communities. The discovery of the 3D printed firearm raised concerns about the future of law enforcement, highlighting the ease with which people could now create untraceable weapons. The cryptic messages on the ammunition only deepened the mystery surrounding Luigi's motivations. His actions had clearly been symbolic as much as they were tactical. This wasn't just a crime, it was an act of defiance, a rejection of a system he had come to view as corrupt and unjust. As the legal proceedings began, they became a spectacle that captivated the nation. Luigi faced multiple charges, including first-degree murder in New York, where the crime occurred, and additional charges in Pennsylvania related to weapons and his flight from the authorities. The federal government also became involved, charging him with acts of terrorism. The complexity of the case grew as multiple jurisdictions became involved, each seeking to hold him accountable for his actions. Despite the mounting evidence against him, Luigi maintained a calm and composed demeanor throughout the legal process in court. He appeared unfazed by the gravity of the charges, even smiling at times. This unnerving behavior sparked widespread debate about his mental state and his true motivations. Some saw him as a cold-blooded killer who had executed a brutal crime without remorse, while others began to see him as a symbol of resistance, a man who had taken violent action against a system he believed was fundamentally flawed. The public's reaction to Luigi's crime was deeply divided. On one side were those who saw his actions as unforgivable, an attack on an innocent man, and an act of terror. They demanded justice for Brian Thompson and his family, emphasizing the need for accountability. On the other side, some began to view Luigi as a martyr, a modern-day vigilante who had taken action against the greed and corruption of the health insurance industry. This perspective, though controversial, gained traction in certain circles, particularly on social media. Debates about Luigi's actions raged online, with some labeling him a domestic terrorist, while others praised him as a hero. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with some chanting for justice and others calling for societal change. the conflicting narratives surrounding his crime, the deep divisions in society, revealing the broader tensions over issues like corporate greed, systemic corruption, and the growing distrust in institutions. In the end, Luigi Mangione case became more than just a murder trial, it was a flash show for a national conversation about power corruption and the links to which individual might go when they feel powerless. His crime, while horrific, sparked a debate that went beyond his actions. It forced people to confront the very systems that had driven him to violence. It raised uncomfortable questions about the intersection of personal grievances, systemic injustice, and the potential for radical action, and in the process, it left an indelible mark on the public consciousness, one that would not be easily forgotten. In the wake of Luigi Mangione arrest, a poll conducted soon after the event sent shockwaves through public discourse. It revealed a startling trend. A significant portion of young adults expressed that they found Luigi's actions somewhat acceptable. This finding stirred deep concern, particularly among those who had anticipated clear condemnation of his crime. It raised disquieting questions about the state of societal unrest and the ways in which narrative framing could shape public perceptions of criminal actions. What prompted so many to view Luigi not as a mere criminal, but as a symbol of resistance? Was it his target, a wealthy CEO from a notoriously criticized industry? Or was it a broader cultural sentiment of disenchantment with systemic inequalities and injustices that seemed to resonate with so many? As this public conversation continued to unfold, the legal battle surrounding Luigi's actions progressed. Prosecutors moved swiftly, working to assemble a compelling case against him. They painted a portrait of Luigi as a cold, calculating individual who had meticulously planned the murder with chilling precision. The evidence against him was overwhelming, ranging from damning surveillance footage to witness testimonies that clearly identified him as the perpetrator. Among the most crucial pieces of physical evidence recovered were items that Luigi had kept with him, such as the 3D printed firearm and a notebook chronicling his grievances in the careful orchestration of his plans. The prosecution also highlighted the human toll of his actions, particularly the suffering of Brian Thompson's family, friends, and colleagues. They aimed to provide a vivid portrayal of the anguish caused by the murder, focusing on the devastating emotional and psychological scars left behind by Luigi's calculated actions. Despite the undeniable strength of the prosecution's case, Luigi's defense team was preparing a different approach. They suggested that rather than being driven by sheer malice, Luigi's actions were the result of a moral outrage, a sense of justice gone astray. They pointed to the contents of his notebook, in which he expressed his profound anger at the health insurance industry and its perceived exploitation of vulnerable individuals by framing his actions as a reaction to systemic corruption. The defense team seemed poised to create a narrative that depicted Luigi as a man driven to extreme actions by a deep sense of injustice. While this line of defense could not absolve him of guilt, it opened the door to a rare and controversial tactic: jury nullification. Jury nullification occurs when a jury chooses to acquit a defendant despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. This decision is typically based on the jury's moral or ethical stance on the case. In Luigi's instance, the defense appeared to be laying the groundwork for such an outcome by emphasizing his motivations and positioning his actions as a response to broader societal issues. By doing so, they sought to appeal to the jury's sense of empathy for Luigi's frustrations. Even if they were unable to condone his methods, the possibility of jury nullification introduced a significant wrinkle in the case, further complicating the dynamics of the trial for the prosecution. This posed a considerable challenge. While they were focused on proving Luigi's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, they also had to counter any potential sympathy jurors might feel toward his ideological motivations. They needed to convince the jury that while Luigi's grievances may have been rooted in legitimate concerns, his violent actions were unjustifiable and should not be excused. No matter the underlying reasons for the defense, pursuing this strategy was risky, as it rested on the idea that certain jurors might resonate with Luigi's ideological position and ultimately vote to acquit him on moral grounds. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt as the trial unfolded, it became clear that the case was no longer just about the actions of a single individual. It had become a symbol of larger societal debates, involving questions of justice, moral responsibility, and how the public frames crime and punishment. Luigi Mangione case was no longer just a criminal trial. It was rapidly transforming into a cultural moment that forced society to examine uncomfortable truths about systemic inequality, frustration with power structures, and the complex relationship between activism and violence. This trial was no longer solely focused on Luigi as a person, but on the broader context of the issues he claimed to represent. The trial quickly gained national attention, with the media covering every development. Public opinion remained sharply divided, with some viewing Luigi as a cold-blooded killer, deserving of the harshest penalties the law could impose to them. There could be no justification for the murder of Brian Thompson, regardless of Luigi's grievances with the health insurance industry. These individuals saw Luigi's actions as a tragic, senseless isolation of frustration, a belief that no societal issue, no matter how pressing, should ever be resolved through violence. On the other hand, a growing number of voices, especially within certain circles, began to frame Luigi as a martyr for a larger cause. Online forums and social media platforms erupted with debates, with some users even expressing admiration for his actions. To them, Luigi had taken a stand against a corrupt, unjust system that exploited vulnerable people for financial gain. His actions, while EXT were viewed by some as a form of resistance, an attempt to call attention to the inequities of the health insurance industry and the power structures that perpetuated it. These supporters, while not condoning the murder, began to see Luigi as someone who had been pushed to extremes by a system that had ignored the needs of ordinary people. His act, in their eyes, was one of defiance against an industry they viewed as corrupt and self-serving. The contrasting views of Luigi's actions played out in the public protests surrounding the trial outside the courthouse. Two opposing groups gathered in tense demonstrations. On one side, activists and citizens demanded justice for Brian Thompson, urging the court to impose the harshest sentence possible.